From the low desert in beautiful Tempe, Arizona, this is Politics and the Past. It is Saturday, October the 11th, 2025. This is Robert Ferguson doing a solo episode of Politics and the Past. Today, I was really hoping to do a bit of a deep dive. I know I'm on my own, and when I'm on my own, it's going to be a little bit tricky because I'm going to have to try to naturally fill gaps that I would prefer to have somebody else help fill with me. But hopefully we can still make this work. Today I want to discuss one of the underappreciated Federalist Papers, Federalist 41, which was written by James Madison, and it's a really broad, far-reaching Federalist paper that I think kind of gets diminished because there's nothing really innovative in it. But what I really want to emphasize and focus on in Federalist 41 is this is it's really one of the finest defenses of union that you're ever likely to find in American history. It There are other documents, and I'll bring them up throughout the this discussion that do make a similar case for union that Federalist 41 does. But in my opinion, I don't think it ever quite reaches the actual relatively simple, elegant argument made for the importance of union that you find in Federalist 41. Given that this is the first time I've really talked about the Federalist Papers on this podcast, it's probably worth doing a bit of a background on what the Federalist Papers actually were. They were a series of essays that were written by three men, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison, in the fall of 1787, and through the winter and spring of 1788. They were written ostensibly to the people of New York, who were going to be responsible for deciding whether or not to ratify the newly written U.S. Constitution. The Constitution was written in the summer of 1787 at a convention in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The convention was called in order to address some of the limitations that had existed under the previous Constitution that the United States operated under, which was called the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation were not really the details of a true union. Instead, it's probably best if we consider the Articles of Confederation as a treaty for a league of sovereign states. While the Articles of Confederation Congress did have some sovereignty, it really had very little power in order to coerce the individual states. So it's probably best to imagine that the United States, under the Articles of Confederation, which officially was from 1781 to 1787, although really goes back to the fallout from the Declaration of Independence, is a what Congress is in that period is a league of semi-independent sovereign states where there was really very little way to rally a national will. And this had manifested itself with several crises that had occurred in the early and mid 1780s that Congress itself was unable to resolve, and the various states were probably exacerbating the situation. For instance, in 1783, peace is signed with the British. at the Treaty of Paris. One of the conditions of the treaty is that while the British will leave their forts scattered around the 13 colonies, the Americans agreed to pay back existing debts. That would mean private debt. So the idea being that if a an American had bought something on credit or borrowed some money from a British merchant predating the Revolution, that American was still going to be on the hook for paying it back. This, as you can imagine, if you are a citizen of the United States who owes money, maybe considerable money, to a British merchant or a British creditor, you're not going to be very happy about this. And you are probably going to make a lot of noise in your state legislature to not have that state legislature, that state government pursue that debt. And so while the Congress of the United States, the what you might call the League government, actually signed the treaty, it was going to be up to the state governments to actually enforce it. And the state legislatures, there was very little incentive for them to actually enforce it. The incentives, in fact, all worked the other direction because representatives wanted to get voted in, and a really bad way to try to curry popularity with the population was to say, hey, you have to pay your debts. So there was what the British did in response is the British just did not abandon their forts or refused to abandon a few of the forts, which made it very difficult for Americans who were seeking to settle westward in order to clear out the British military force there. In 1787, before the Constitution is signed, the Congress does sign the Northwest Ordinance, which establishes 5 new states: Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, and I'm probably missing one, but and Illinois. These states are going to be settled. Land is going to be very cheap, if not free. And the idea being that this will finally push American settlement westward. There was also not going to be any slavery in these 5 states. This was always going to be very difficult for a government that had very little ability to coerce the states in order to actually execute. The fact that they actually got an agreement to do so is pretty remarkable given how difficult passing anything was in the Articles of Confederation Congress. Um, as each state got one vote in the Congress, and most things had to be unanimous. So it was remarkable that even the Northwest Ordinance was passed. And remember, this is a place that was free of slavery, and yet Southern states did support it. Still, there were while the Congress managed to pass this act, it was fairly well understood by virtually everybody that the Articles of Confederation Congress was not up to the task of something like westward settlement, and a new union was going to be required. And in the summer of 1787, several delegates from the states met in Philadelphia, and in a very miserable, hot, um, indoor climate, hammered out the details of what we now know to be the U.S. Constitution. I don't really want to go too far into those details because what we're really going to talk about today is just one aspect of it, which is what's touched on in Federalist 41. So I mentioned earlier that the Federalist Papers were a series of essays that were authored by John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison, and published in New York newspapers. The purpose, again, was to convince New Yorkers, particularly the New York State Legislature, to actually ratify the Constitution, to vote for the Constitution. New York was a tricky place to get the Constitution passed because one of the biggest opponents of the Constitution was the governor of New York, a man named George Clinton. Clinton, opposed the Constitution on for a few reasons, but the primary reason that he actually opposed it was because of tariff revenue. The new Constitution would put the federal government in charge of tariff revenue, and tariff revenue would accrue to the national government. New York, up until this point, relied very heavily on tariff revenue, and Clinton was concerned that by moving this tariff revenue from the state to the national government, New York would have to find a new revenue stream, which he was unsure they'd be able to do. Um, Clinton it Clinton was probably one of the foremost anti-federalists. He often wrote under the nom de plume Cato. At least that's the theory. And he also published several criticisms of the Constitution in New York newspapers that the Federalists, Jay, Hamilton, and Madison, were responding to. Um, Jay Hamilton and Madison, who were issuing the Federalist Papers, did so under a single pseudonym. The pseudonym was Publius. At the time, readers would have understood that Publius referred to a Roman statesman who was a major figure at the beginning of the Roman Republic. In the 6th century BC, Rome transitions from a monarchy to a republic, and Publius is one of the consuls that is responsible for the formation of this new grand republic. So, by taking the pseudonym Publius, Jay Madison and Hamilton hoped to sort of present themselves as the founders of a grand republic. The Anti-Federalists, meanwhile, chose names like Cato and Brutus. Um, Cato and Brutus are probably more familiar to a modern audience. They were figures at the end of the Roman Republic who were trying to save the Republic from falling into what they viewed to be tyranny. They were prominent senators. Brutus was involved in the assassination of Julius Caesar, and Cato was one of the biggest critics of Caesar in the Senate. So these names are symbolic. Publius is symbolic because the authors of the Federalist Papers believed that they were founding the great republic. Meanwhile, the anti-federalists chose names like Cato and Brutus because they believed they were trying to save a great republic from falling into tyranny, which they believed the Constitution did. So, anyway, there's a series of essays back and forth between Publius and figures like Cato and Brutus. Ma Initially, Madison, Hamilton, and Jay tried to kind of um, camouflage their participation, but it was pretty clear pretty quickly who the three men were. The whole project was the brainchild of Alexander Hamilton. I'm sure most people who are listening to this know who Alexander Hamilton was, or at least have heard of Alexander Hamilton. He was an aide de camp to General Washington during the Revolutionary War, was a major figure in New York finance by the mid 1780s. He eventually had a monopoly on New York banking and tried to and established as the first Secretary of the Treasury the first bank of the United States. On top of that, he was also a pretty impressive economist. His notes on manufactures is one of the earliest examples of a modern economic uh, treatise that speaks to the importance of protectionism to the growth of infant industry. And it's a again, it kind of unites how a central bank and protectionism can work in order to foster uh, a type of commercial industrial revolution. Hamilton will be the primary, principal, I guess, advocate for for the United States to become a commercial hegemon. Eventually, he will be countered by men like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who he wrote the Federalist Papers with, who see the United States as being a great agrarian republic as opposed to a great commercial republic. But that battle's in the future in 1787. In 1787, they're just Hamilton is just trying to get the Constitution passed, and Madison and John Jay are allies. Madison initially wanted to bring in, or initially intended just to partner with John Jay, and the first 9 of the Federalist Papers, I believe, or I think one is written by Hamilton, and then 2 through 9 are written by Jay, or 2 through 8 are written by Jay. But John Jay gets very sick, and he is basically throughout this entire period is recuperating. So Hamilton has to recruit somebody else, and he's kind of casting around New York for somebody else to fill this void of John Jay, and he decides on this willing younger Virginia representative uh, to the Congress, the Articles of Confederation Congress, James Madison. Madison had been one of the key figures at the Constitutional Convention. He was the only guy that attended every session, and he also took incredible notes. And he had written a document called The Vices of the Political System of the United States earlier in 1787 that kind of foreshadows a lot of what happens at the convention and then what's in the Federalist Papers. So Madison was very critical of the Articles of Confederation system and had begun to kind of imagine a how a newer United States might look. So it turned out he was actually the perfect partner for Alexander Hamilton. In future, they will become great political opponents, but in 1787, they're very good allies. The Federalist Papers are, there's 85 of them. Most of them are outstanding. The ones that people remember, the 2 most iconic are 10 and 51. Those are written by James Madison, and anybody who's taken a civics class has had to read Federalist 10 and Federalist 51. So that's why I wanted to focus on Federalist 41, because it's something that maybe, unless you've really done a deep dive into the Federalist Papers, you've never really encountered. Um, so you can find stuff on Federalist 10 and Federalist 51 virtually everywhere. But so we're kind of picking a slightly different one here to do a bit of a deep dive on. Federalist 41 was written by James Madison. So again, it wasn't clear initially who wrote them all, but this one has been attributed to James Madison. And the title of it is General View of the Powers Conferred by the Constitution. Madison is, in this essay, he is arguing for the fact that the Constitution has now created this federal government, with a great deal more power than exists in the Articles of Confederation Congress. And he is responding to anti-federalist criticism that such power is unnecessary, that the power is best left vested in the states with a very weak national government. And Madison is actually saying the opposite. He says a much stronger national government is required, and that the states, in fact, are um, while they aren't necessarily going to be weakened, that a strong national government is necessary for several purposes. But there's one aspect I really want to tease out here, and that is that a strong national government is the only way for Americans to protect Americans' liberties. So in Federalist 41, Madison sets up that well, first of all, one of the things that Madison says about the new Constitution, and I really think that this is important, especially to understanding James Madison, but maybe to the American experiment itself. And maybe a part of a consequence of that is that the American experiment itself, at least in its constitutional form, owes something to James Madison. And Madison was not a perfectionist. He was not a radical. Madison believed that, there was nothing perfect and nothing was ever going to be perfect. And so what you needed to do is you needed to create redundancies. You needed to create um you needed to create various vehicles by which enterprising, decent, virtuous people could use the mechanisms of government for the best purposes, and also to make sure there were sufficient obstacles to tyranny. And again, Madison, this is important. He says the he's criticizing the anti-federalists here. And it says that, they've chosen rather to dwell on the inconveniences, which must be unavoidably blended with all political advantages, and on the possible abuses, which must be incident to every power or trust of which a beneficial use can be made. And by that he means that the Anti Federalists are criticizing virtually every power that the national government has as if it's necessarily going to lead to tyranny. And he continues, this method of handling the subject cannot impose on the good sense of the people of America. It may display the subtlety of the writer. It may open a boundless field for rhetoric and declamation. It may inflame the passions of the unthinking and may confirm the prejudices of the misthinking. But cool and candid people will at once reflect that the purest of human blessings must have a portion of alloy in them, that the choice must always be made, if not of the lesser evil, at least of the greater, not the perfect, good, and that in every political institution, a power to advance the public happiness involves a discretion which may be misapplied and abused. That's important to Madison's thinking. He's laying it out there. He's saying, listen, I understand that anytime we create a political institution, we're creating some vehicle that could be abused and become tyrannical. However, we need political institutions. So what are we going to do about that? And so this is why he says we must choose, if not of the lesser evil, at least of the greater, if not the perfect, good. He understands the system is not perfect. So, why does he suggest this system where there's going to be more power that gets sucked up into the national government? Well, he says there's 5 reasons. One is security against foreign danger. Two, regulation of the intercourse with foreign nations. Three, maintenance of harmony and proper intercourse among the states. Four, certain miscellaneous objects of general utility. Five, restraint of the states from certain injurious acts. I'm going to focus on the first three here particularly. So, Madison, when we're dealing with security against foreign danger. So, in the Constitution, the powers that particularly are associated with the security against foreign danger are those of declaring war, granting letters of marque, providing armies of fleets, of regulating and calling forth the militia, and of levying and borrowing money. As Madison states, security against foreign danger is one of the primitive objects of civil society. It's an avowed and essential object of the American Union, and the powers requisite for attaining it must be effectually confided to the federal councils. So first he deals with um, is it, is the power of declaring war necessary? And Madison says, of course that it is. And in fact, even the existing Confederation had that. So then he says, okay, but it's maybe a little bit, what's a little bit different is that this new government has the indefinite power to raise troops and providing fleets and allowing them to be maintained in both peace and war. That's a significant difference between the new Constitution and the Articles of Confederation. Now, he says, listen, a lot of these have been dealt with already, but he wants to um, emphasize one bit here, and I think this is really important. He says the reason that these powers are indefinite is because if a federal constitution could chain the ambition or set bounds to the exertions of all other nations, then indeed might it prudently chain the discretion of its own government and set bounds to the exertions for its own safety. So he's arguing that, you know, the reason these powers are indefinite is because we cannot actually fathom what the enemy might do. If the enemy has unbounded power or infinite power, then the federal government better have that same power in order to meet the enemy. Because, of course, being able to provide for the security of the new nation has always been the primary goal of civil government. So, as Madison says, it is in vain to oppose constitutional barriers to the impulse of self-preservation. So he is saying, listen, we understand that there's going to be a type of that the federal government is going to have this sort of vague, indefinite power to raise troops and money in order to deal with an external threat. And he's saying that like it kind of has to be. And to be fair to Madison, either you can agree with it or disagree with it. There has, in virtually every series of rules governing states that has ever existed, whether those rules are written, unwritten, or just conventions, there's always been this sort of in case of emergency break glass provision, where in the case of the Roman Republic, there was the chance that, you could appoint a dictator for a year. In the case of the American Constitution, it allows for things like the suspension of habeas corpus in the event of rebellion. There is always sort of this vague, almost total authority that can be taken by some office or some force in the event of an existential threat. And the reason that that exists is that to some degree, there's always framers of these rules understand that if the preservation of the society is the primary goal of civil government, and there's really no limit to what an external threat might look like, you have to have the ability to actually protect that civil society without breaking the Constitution itself. So, um, and Madison is arguing here that, we really cannot fathom or imagine what type of external threat we might one day face. For instance, could Madison have imagined, nuclear bombs on the tips of ICBMs? And yet, there needs to be some provision in the Constitution to allow for protection against that as those threats emerge. This is maybe one of the most interesting things that that Madison emphasizes here. He says that, also the United States needs to be able to have a standing army. And the reason is because you need some You need some ordinary protection against external threat. Just being able to raise militias on the regular is not going to be enough. Um, so y- Madison argues here that one of the reasons that absolutist governments emerged in Europe beginning in the 15th century was that Charles VII of France um, began to threaten everybody, and that he raised a massive army, he threatened his neighbors, he waged war against his neighbors, and that it was only because those states were able to create standing armies and had the power um, to be able to counter the threat from Charles VII. And that while that has led to the permanent establishment of these armies, had those armies not been permanently established, it is likely that there would have been one universal monarch in Europe that would have taken power a long time ago. So, and Madison says here, had the example not been followed by all other nations, all Europe must long ago have worn the chains of a universal monarch. Were every nation except France now to disband its peace establishment, the same event might follow. And then he takes it back to Roman history, where he says the veteran legions of Rome were an overmatch for the undisciplined valor of all other nations, and rendered her mistress of the world. So now Madison also understands that it was believed at the time, particularly among Republican theorists, that a standing army could be a threat to liberty. But as Madison says here, a standing force is dangerous to liberty, but it's also a necessary provision for liberty too. Where he says here, on the smallest scale, it has its inconveniences. On an extensive scale, its consequences may be fatal. On any scale, it is an object of laudable circumspection and precaution. But a wise nation will combine all these considerations, and whilst it does not rashly preclude itself from any resource which may become essential to its safety, will exert all its prudence in diminishing both the necessity and the danger of resorting to one which may be inauspicious to its liberties. And this is where Madison says the US Constitution, and particularly the Union, do this better than any other mechanism is possible in the United States. He says the clearest marks of this prudence, basically balancing the necessity of a standing army against the threat that a standing army gives to liberty. The clearest mark of this prudence are stamped on the proposed Constitution. Particularly, he's referring to the existence of the Union itself. This is Madison now. The Union itself, which the Constitution cements and secures, destroys every pretext for a military establishment which could be dangerous. America united, with a handful of troops or even without a single soldier, exhibits a more forbidding posture to foreign ambition than America disunited, with 100,000 veterans ready for combat. This is one of we'll talk about this a little bit more. He'll discuss this in a little more detail shortly, but this is one of the keys to early American political thought, that the Union was necessary to protect individual liberties. And this will end up being part of the justification that Abraham Lincoln will use for waging war to protect the Union. The belief was that with the Union, with a national government, with a union, with a standing army in order to protect the states, there was no need for states to have regular forces of their own. There was a concern that if the Articles of Confederation continued, that the militias of the various states would eventually become standing armies. And the reason for that was that there was nothing that there was no institution worthy of the various states uniting themselves under. It was believed by many of these early American political theorists that if the states were allowed to retain maximum sovereignty, that eventually the states would just become independent and there would be no America. There would just be a South Carolina, Georgia, New Jersey, New York, and that the states would, at least according to Madison, these states themselves would probably end up going to war with each other, or at least they'd be afraid of going to war with each other, which would force the states to have massive standing armies. It's one thing to be afraid of a European threat that's across the ocean and to have a responsible standing army along with a maybe a considerable navy in order to at least deter that European threat that has to cross an ocean first. Um, it'd be quite different if you lived in North Carolina and you were afraid of Virginia. It was believed by people like James Madison, and this is James Madison for a moment. The moment of the Union's dissolution will be the date of a new order of things. The fears of the weaker or the ambition of the stronger states or confederacies will set the same example in the New World as Charles VII did in the Old World. The example will be followed here from the same motives which produced universal imitation there. Instead of deriving from our situation the precious advantage which Great Britain has derived from hers, and here Madison is arguing that one of the reasons that Great Britain has remained one of the most liberal of European nations is that the Channel protected her from needing a large standing army to protect Great Britain from invasion. So that meant that there didn't have to be a massive standing army in Britain, and which the standing armies would be a threat to individual liberty in the country. So this is Madison again. Instead of deriving from our situation the precious advantage which Great Britain has derived from hers, the face of America will be but a copy of that of the continent of Europe. It will present liberty everywhere, crushed between standing armies and perpetual taxes. The fortunes of disunited America will be even more disastrous than those of Europe. The sources of evil in the latter are confined to her own limits. No superior powers of another quarter of the globe intrigue among her rival nations, inflame their mutual animosities, and render them the instruments of foreign ambition, jealousy, and revenge. It's a little bit ironic because, of course, the Americans u- use the existing animosities of France and Spain with Great Britain to great effect during the Revolutionary War, but that's neither here nor there. This is Madison again. In America, the miseries springing from her internal jealousies, contentions, and wars would form a part only of her lot. A plentiful addition of evils would have their source in that relation in which Europe stands to this quarter of the earth, and which no other quarter of the earth bears to Europe. This picture of the consequences of disunion cannot be too highly colored or too often exhibited. Every man who loves peace, every man who loves his country, every man who loves liberty ought to have it ever before his eyes, that he may cherish in his heart a due attachment to the Union of America, and be able to set a due value on the means of preserving it. This is, I think, the strongest argument ever made for why the Union of the United States must be preserved at all costs. Since the founding, at least since the end of the founding era, there have been many attempts, many, um, many campaigns, usually not big ones, although there was, of course, one big one that led to the creation of the Confederate States and the Civil War. But there have been many attempts on some level to create, um, to suggest that maybe the people of the United States are too heterogeneous. The interests are too diverse for it to exist under one union. But as Madison cleanly lays out there, the moment you have disunion, the moment you create several states, whether it's through a process of balkanization, um, or it just would have been that the union never would have been created in the first place, at least under the Constitution, there would have been nothing stopping the states from going to war with one another. And would have meant the which would have meant that each state would have had a major standing army, and rather than drawing for a st for the rather than drawing from a massive country to provision an army, each state could only draw from its own population, meaning the taxes would become incredibly burdensome. The ability to raise money through debt would have also been significantly limited, again, leaving, taxation as being the primary means by which a government, could by which a state government would provision its military. And who knows what those wars would have portended. One of the great advantages the United States has also maintained, partly by good luck and partly by, maybe mutual history, is that the United States to its north has not had has not had a military or significant military rival. Because since the War of 1812, the British North America, which will eventually become the country of Canada, has generally had good relations with the United States, although entirely that's not universal. There were periods where there have been some significant economic rivalry between the two. At no point has it ever reached the point where war seemed imminent. And so what that's allowed is for both Canada and the United States to not have to have massive standing armies staring at each other. There's never been an arms race between the two. Of course, that arms race wouldn't last very long. But the same is generally true of the southern border of the United States. So the standing army, the major standing army that the United States has created, um, in the um, decades following the Civil War, could be used in the process of westward expansion, and then, for the protection of allies overseas and for the protection of markets and sea lanes around the world. It's The standing army has never really been needed for protection and for existential protection. And that's really important because if it was needed for that, then there'd be no limits to the type of taxation and to the limits on personal liberties that the Union would have to impose on American citizens. However, if the Union were to disintegrate, it would be worse. Imagine you're a citizen of North Carolina and you're concerned about invasion from Virginia. What would that imposition on your liberties look like? You need lots of taxation, you probably require conscription, and the state government would have to be very powerful. In fact, we don't even need to speculate. We don't even need to make it a hypothetical because historians or anybody who's read much about the Civil War know is that although there's some esoteric corners of history that view the Confederate government as being some beacon of personal liberty, um, it never was. Of course, not a surprise. This is a government that was existed and founded on the institution of slavery. But during the Civil War, the Confederate government was vicious to its citizens. The conscription, um, conscription, the bond issuances, um, the military law that was essentially imposed by various state governors across the Confederacy was brutal. And I don't necessarily know whether that was some inherent aspect of the Confederacy or just the fact that it was at war. It was being invaded. Um, Even threats of invasion. For instance, in Georgia, Governor Joseph Brown formed the Georgia Guard. It's not the actual term. I can't think of the actual term for it, but it was a type of paramilitary that was dispatched to the North Georgia mountains in order to protect against um, guerrilla Union groups. That was only a split of the Union into two countries. What happened if the Union was split into several? What happens if if what is currently the United States were to be turned into Yugoslavia? You would see frequent and constant, animosity, tensions that would require the raising of armies, um, that would require imposing on personal liberties, on individual liberties that Americans cherish. So the reason, according to James Madison, that it is necessary for this new national government to be as powerful as it is because, quote, the pictures of the consequences of disunion cannot be too highly colored or too often exhibited. As Madison says, every man who loves peace, every man who loves his country, and every man who loves liberty ought to have it ever before his eyes that he may cherish in his heart a due attachment to the Union of America and be able to set a due value on the means of preserving it. In his farewell address, George Washington says something very similar. George Washington is concerned about factionalism, and Madison has a very different take on factionalism. Madison's actually is fine with faction. Madison believes you just need lots of factions and diverse interests in the Union, and this is why Federalist 10 is so famous, is because this is where he really begins talking about that, and turns classical Republican theory on its head. But in Washington's farewell address, He claims that factionalism is going to render the Union into several parts. And like Madison, Washington says, when you have disunion, you are going to force state governments to significantly impose on individuals' cherished liberties in order to preserve their security. This is, I suppose, um, one of those instances where there is no perfect line to balance liberty and security. Uh, Hayek once famously said that every advance in security is a loss in liberty. And I mean, I think there's some truth to that. But that ultimately, at least in the liberal tradition, which the United States fits into, there's this understanding that a certain degree of security is necessary to preserve liberty. And however, too much security is, of course, devastating to liberty. And so, how you draw that line has always been at the forefront of politics, institution building. During the formation of the U.S. Constitution in 1787, that was top of mind to the framers. How do we build an enduring document, an enduring institution that balances liberty with security? The Anti-Federalists, who, to be fair to the Anti-Federalists, most of them did not think that the Articles of Confederation were some perfect, great document. They didn't. They understood its weaknesses. They just thought that the U.S. Constitution went too far. Very famously, they really pointed to Section 8 of Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. And this is where, if I just give me a second here to find it because I want to get it exactly right. This is where, in the last clause of the eighth section of the first article, it authorizes the national legislature, quote, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the powers by that Constitution vested in the government of the United States. Anti-Federalists believe that Section 8, combined with the powers that Madison was talking about in Federalist 41, were bound to create a federal government that basically eliminated the existence of state governments, but and then eventually would become a tyranny in itself. This is not a discussion of Federalist 10, so I'm going to kind of leave it at that. But anyway, the Federalist 41 goes on to discuss a whole bunch more, and I don't really want to overcomplicate this. The only other thing that I'll mention is that one of the powers that Madison mentioned is that the U.S. Constitution, of course, um, gives the federal government the um, ability to raise to raise money as well, in order for protection of the United States. And he just goes on to it here, and I think it's just really important. The power of levying and borrowing money, being the sinew of that, which is to be exerted in the national defense, was very famously called sinews of war somewhere else, um, is can only be given to the federal government and the national government. And I only bring that up because there were some anti-federalist arguments at the time that it should be that should be left to state governments. But Lastly, this is lastly, in Federalist 41, there's a really great paragraph, and it's not necessarily related to anything that I mentioned before, but other than the fact of why this new government needs to be so powerful and why there needs to be some flexibility in the document, as opposed to just listing out exactly what this new national government can do. Um, this is Madison again. I will address one additional reflection only to those who contend that the power ought to have been restrained to external taxation. So this goes back to the levying money, in that there's the the US government in the Constitution. It's kind of open-ended as to the ways that they can raise revenue. It very explicitly says that they can raise money off of tariffs, but there's nothing necessarily preventing the US government from finding other ways to raise revenue. And so he's just addressing that. He says, I will address one additional reflection only to those who contend that the power ought to have been restrained to external taxation, by which they mean taxes on articles imported from other countries, so just tariffs. It cannot be doubted that this will always be a valuable source of revenue, that for a considerable time it must be a principal source, that at this moment it is an essential one. And this is where it gets important. But we may form very mistaken ideas on this subject if we do not call to mind in our calculations that the extent of revenue drawn from foreign commerce must vary with the variations, both in the extent and the kind of imports, and that these variations do not correspond with the progress of population, which must be the general measure of the public wants. As long as agriculture continues to be the sole field of labor, the importation of manufactures must increase as the consumers multiply. As soon as domestic manufactures are begun by the hands not called for by agriculture, the imported manufactures will decrease as the number of people increase. In a more remote stage, the imports may consist in a considerable part of raw materials, which will be wrought into articles for exportation and will therefore require rather the encouragement of bounties than to be loaded with discouraging duties. A system of government meant for duration ought to contemplate these revolutions and be able to accommodate itself to them. What Madison is saying is that in the 1780s, revenue brought through a tariff made sense. The country was largely agrarian, but there was still a demand for foreign goods. So there was a steady supply of foreign goods coming into the country that could be taxed. However, saying that in the future, that's not always going to be the case. What if we become industrial? Which, of course, the United States will. What if our imports decrease? What if, in fact, we want to encourage exports? How will tariffs help that? So there needs to be some flexibility of thinking and some flexibility built into the document to actually allow the national government to raise revenue in other cases. Otherwise, the US government would be limited to tariffs permanently. Anyway, um, I'm not saying that uh, for any reason other than to mention that the document was intended to be written for posterity. It was intended for perpetual union, even if, of course, perpetuals is probably a little bit far-fetched. But for those of you who are interested, I encourage you to read Federalist 41. I kind of only touched on it here. There's lots of other really interesting Federalist Papers. Maybe we'll go into it at another time. But while most people tend to focus on Federalist 10 and Federalist 51 for very good reason, I do think that especially at a time of national polarization, especially at a time where we are eager to separate ourselves based on political beliefs, it's important to remember why they formed a union in the first place, which was that disunited, we are going to fear each other, threaten each other, and that states are going to have to become tyrannical in order to protect themselves. Whereas in a union, we can preserve our liberties while still balancing security. All right. Well, thank you very much. That was me on my own. I don't know how good it was, how interesting it was, but thank you very much. And if you made it this far, I am very grateful for your patience. And thank you very much. And next time I will definitely have somebody to help bail me out. Thank you very much.